Good day, pop culture lovers. Welcome to a closer look with your host, Professor Pop Culture. Today we're going to be looking at a franchise that has been around since the 1950s, has spawned many parodies, spin-offs, merchandise, toys, board games, and even a cartoon, as well as one really bad spin-off. It involves a giant lizard destroying Tokyo. You know it, you love it. It's the Godzilla franchise. To begin, I want to preface this by saying the timeline will end at Godzilla, the 2014 film, and it will not cover Shin Godzilla or Godzilla King of the Monsters. I've seen Godzilla King of the Monsters, and I have not seen Shin Godzilla, and I'd rather do a little bit more research on both of those before I include them. Well, without further ado, let's begin. The kaiju movie genre has become a mainstay in popular culture since it began in the 1930s with King Kong. I say King Kong is a kaiju movie because recently he has become known as a kaiju based on the fact that he has had his own movie in the Godzilla universe, that being Kong Skull Island, thus making him a kaiju. However, if you're a Godzilla purist, you'll know that Godzilla from the 1950s is the original kaiju movie. Now, this original movie has had its meaning changed over time. And that's really the main point of this video, is we're going to discuss and try to start a conversation on the evolution of Godzilla as a whole. You know, where is it now? Is it still this personification of fear and uncertainty and destruction and doom, or is it something else entirely now? Has its meaning shifted as the movies have, gone on? And in order to do that, we got to set up a little bit of a timeline here. Godzilla has its own timeline that spans 4 or 5 periods, maybe 6, depending on how you divide up the 32 movie franchise. The first part of the franchise we're going to take a look at is known as the Showa period, from 1954 to 1975. This is Godzilla's origins, his start in black and white to maybe 1 or 2 color movies. The Heisei period was the next one that spans from 1984 to 1995, the Millennium period from 1999 to 2004, and lastly, the current period, 2006 to today. And there's also an American timeline. I don't know if you want to count that or not. It includes the 1999 Godzilla movie that is questionable at best, as well as the Legendary Pictures Godzilla that began in 2014 and has since spawned one sequel, Godzilla King of the Monsters, that came out a couple years ago. Or last year. So, how do we start this? Well, let's start it by looking at the original, the OG Godzilla. Black and white, no color, definitely a man in a rubber suit. So let's take a look at it. And that is Godzilla King of the Monsters, created in 1954, directed by Ishiro Honda. I've already explained the plot, that a nuclear test goes wrong and a radiated lizard grows to immense proportions and then wreaks havoc on Tokyo. But, let's talk a little bit about that movie. The first depiction of the creature was created by Tomoyuki Tanaka. And in a 1985 interview, which I will link in the description, he states that in those days, Japanese had a real horror of radiation. And the horror is what made Godzilla so huge. From the beginning, he has symbolized nature's revenge on mankind. Let's talk about that for a second. So, Godzilla was originally created to personify this revenge nature has for all these bad things mankind has done. And the catalyst for that revenge is radiation. Radiation gave Mother Nature a chance to fight back. And it's interesting to look at it that way. I feel a lot of people don't see it as Mother Nature fighting back is more or less as seeing it as, just another one of those movies where, oh, nuclear test goes wrong, something gets bigger than it should, destroys the whole town. Godzilla's always had that interesting, deeper meaning to it, that extra little depth to it. More than just nuclear test goes wrong, something destroys everything else, everyone bands together and defeats it. Godzilla is more than that. And I think if we look at an interview from Ishiro Honda, we can get a little bit more of an insight to it. This is in relation to a question posed to him in which he's asked why this movie has kind of like a documentary feel to it. And Ishiro Honda says, the intention of not only the screenwriter, but also the entire production staff was to focus on how people would react if a creature such as Godzilla really did appear. What would the politicians do? About the scientists? How would the military handle the situation? Given this, it was inevitable that the film would seem at least somewhat like a documentary. Godzilla from the beginning is not like its predecessors, such as King Kong or the Beast from 2000 Fathoms. Godzilla has, an air of realism to it. Before, people thought it was funny to laugh at the man in the rubber suit. If we watch a movie like this today, it doesn't seem realistic at all. Like, we know that building is really just a tiny building. Or those planes really aren't planes. But if we look at it from the eyes of someone alive during this time, just seeing this in the theater, you would see that it has some sort of striking realism to them. This could really happen. It's a part of their reality. And that's fascinating to look at, especially when it comes to that deeper meaning. Because when you make a movie like this, and you have to say, well, how would the politicians react? How would, scientists react? How would the military react? I think another piece of that puzzle is, how would people react? Yes, there will be people running in fear and, screaming for their lives, maybe doing some worse things during this time, but it's still a key factor in, looking at this monster, who really isn't a monster. He's a creation by man that has one purpose: destroy. It's the only thing he knows how to do. So from the start of the film's purpose, as I've mentioned, Godzilla was never meant to be the spectacular shows put on by other monsters. It's, like I said, grounded in reality. It sets itself apart from other monster movies because it puts itself in a place that it could actually happen. And that really just plays into it all. So, one of the main abilities that Godzilla has is a laser blast from its mouth. It's a stunning bright light that directly can be traced It's a stunning bright light that can be traced to the brilliant light shown before a nuclear bomb goes off. It's usually, shown by the scales on his back lighting up before the large laser is emitted from his mouth. The power is even referred to as atomic breath. And, this kind of played into the American market. Now, the American market kind of, I feel, lost that realism because they began to make movie after movie after movie about this. It all began with the movie Them, about giant tarantulas that became giant because of a nuclear test and went on to destroy a town somewhere in the desert. Now, I want to bring up a side point. Godzilla had an American release. It was strange to say the least. They took the entire movie, dubbed over in English, And in order to make it more appealing for the American audience, they inserted the famous American actor Raymond Burr as a main character. And it kind of lost itself in translation. It didn't become, that realistic, grounded movie that could really happen as it did in Japan. In America, it was more like another Disney movie that came out. It had a famous American actor in it. Everything was dubbed over. It was produced solely for the purpose of being able to cash in on that American market. Now, I know that isn't really the entire purpose. That's part of my own opinion. But you have to admit, some of it is lost in translation if you change the story to center around an American rather than the main character that is the monster. The second movie in this period is called Godzilla Raids Again, or Godzilla vs. Gigantus. Gigantus is the first monster that Godzilla really fights. And Gigantus is reawoken because of nuclear fallout. Gigantus can breathe fire and is given the title Killer of the Living. And this, again, is to drive home that fear. That fear that all this nuclear radiation is doing something bad to Mother Nature, and Mother Nature's about to fight back. So, and it just has this main point that all this radiation is in the end just going to come to bite everyone in the butt. In the most recent movies, there's an idea where when you push Mother Nature, she pushes back 10 times harder. And, this kind of started here, with this movie. I know I said it kind of started in Godzilla, but now Godzilla has adversaries. So we kind of first see that change and shift in the meaning of what Godzilla is, right here. Where he has someone to fight. It's not about Tokyo anymore. It's about Godzilla versus this person. So, as we go on and look at it, it's a rinse and repeat kind of model. Something wakes up, it's Mother Nature pushing back. Godzilla wakes up, beats up the monster, goes back to sleep. So, it's kind of also a ridiculous step. Firstly, it changes the meaning of Godzilla, ever so slightly. Because he becomes the protector of Tokyo later on. But we'll get to that soon enough. Right now, it's just Godzilla versus Gigantus. But there's, stunts in it that might come across as comedic. Now, I said before that, it was always a man in a rubber suit. The town was never real. It was just, a small town. But Gigantus really did have some ridiculous stunts. Like the fact that it can expend its neck a long distance. And this is, like I said, the start of a downward spiral for Godzilla. So, where did this begin? Well, we're not going to talk about Godzilla. We're going to talk about the company that created Godzilla, the studios. So, the decline in Godzilla and this lost in translation kind of style that comes along with it started when they started turning out movie after movie after movie at the later parts of the Showa period. The movies became more and more fantastical in nature, reaching a fever pitch when the once feared monster gained a son in the movie Son of Godzilla. David Colonia sums up the downward spiral in an article which I will link. This is titled Political Aspects of Kaiju, a case study of the original Godzilla. When they quote, William Sutsu's book, again, I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, In Godzilla's Footstep, Japanese Pop Culture Icons on the Global Stage. The decisive fact for this unequal distribution of analyses within the academia is the evolution, or rather degradation, of the series, which gradually departed from its roots and morphed into lighthearted spectacles for younger audiences. Due to this radical shift in the series' production policy, Godzilla is remembered especially outside of his native country, primarily as the bug-eyed slapstick superhero for kids of the 1960s films, not as the somber and politically engaged monster with a message that began the series in the 1950s. And I think that really just sums up what happens at the end of the Showa period for this guy. If you're curious about Godzilla's son, he does get a spin-off of his own. He helps a kid overcome bullies, kind of like a imaginary friend type thing, except it's Godzilla's son. Also, Godzilla's son can grow and shrink, so he's able to be the size of the boy without being disjarringly huge. So, something kind of changed later on. Godzilla wouldn't be alone. Godzilla fights a monster named Mothra, a giant moth from a place called Monster Island, which we'll talk about later. But Mothra isn't just defeated by Godzilla, or Godzilla defeats Mothra, or Mothra defeats Godzilla. Either way, Mothra becomes an ally to Godzilla, a friend even, that Godzilla counts on when he needs help. He is there when he needs him, and later on he gains another friend or ally in Rodan, a pterodactyl-like creature that is large in size. Mothra is a spin-off movie. It shows the origin of Mothra. Mothra is a giant larvae that eventually becomes a giant moth that fights another giant moth. They use giant laser beams just like Godzilla does, so there's a lot of parallels between Mothra and Godzilla. Mothra aims to be a little bit more fantastical than Godzilla, I would say, since Mothra, originates from Monster Island, has two fairies that control its sleep or wake it up when needed, and the whole plot centers around getting those fairies to be able to help Mothra later on. So, let's shift our focus back to Godzilla. So where are we at this point? At this point, we're at the fact that Godzilla has become more of a joke because of commercialism and a studio that just wanted to keep pushing out movies. So, at the very end of the Showa period, we're introduced to another mainstay of the Godzilla franchise, just like Mothra and Rodan, a being known as King Ghidorah. King Ghidorah is one of the villains found at the end of the Showa period of Godzilla, and eventually became a recurring villain, eventually becoming Mecha Ghidorah. In an interview, when asked about the possible deeper meaning behind King Ghidorah being linked to China acquiring nuclear weapons, this is all in relation to Ishiro Honda. Again, I'll link the interview in the description. I doubt it. Ghidorah was merely meant to be a modern interpretation of the eight-headed snake of Japanese myth. Mr. Sekizawa wrote the screenplay for Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, and he always avoided involving politics in his work. Even Ishiro Honda, that was Ishiro Honda again talking about the screenwriter, and he goes on to say there's no politics here. So immediately from that interview, we can assume that Godzilla is no longer based in this deeper meaning. It's just commercialism now. Now, you can make the interpretation that having Ghidorah be a manifestation of a Japanese myth kind of attributes itself to a legend and starting a little bit more of a mythos in Godzilla. But Godzilla was created because of, a political thing that happened. But now it's detracted and it's gone to including references to Japanese myth. So, moving on, there's a turning point. The Showa period ends, and what's going to happen to Godzilla after this? Well, this is the major turning point that I alluded to when Godzilla fought Gigantus. Godzilla isn't this mindless destroyer anymore. He's a protector. He is a protector of Tokyo. He's no longer their destroyer, but their savior. And he has a home now. He wasn't a lizard created by nuclear radiation. No, he's a monster from Monster Island. So, they needed to return to form with Godzilla. So, what are they going to do? They're going to start a whole new era of movies. And in the 1980s, that began with a direct sequel from Godzilla from the 50s. Which may or may not have been a good idea. But it mirrored the original almost exactly. Godzilla just kind of came out and started to destroy everything in its path. So, you can argue that this version of Godzilla was created as a response to a lot of moral dilemmas Japan was facing in the 1980s. It's a darker spin on Godzilla. Yes, you can argue there were some lighthearted moments, a little bit more jokes here and there, but in contrast to the end of the Showa era, this was supposed to be darker, grittier, kind of reflect that new Japan that's grappling with all these different things. So part of the 1980s is genetics. So what I mean by that is a lot of it came down to, genetics becoming a big thing in science at the time, and the study of genetics and what you're going to do with genetics and designer babies and things like that. And if you don't know what a designer baby is, basically we've gotten to the point in today's society where genetics, you can basically create your own baby. Almost. A lot of it is to do with being able to stop diseases. If you're predisposed to a certain disease, they can go in and eradicate that part of the DNA. So your baby's no longer predisposed to that kind of disease. And it's used in that way. But a lot of fear is that when we're able to, people are just going to pay to have their babies look a certain way. So that's why it's kind of known as designer babies. But another interesting thing about this is pollution. Pollution was a huge issue. So, it's a huge issue because, it's destroying water, it's destroying land, destroying environmental, things, destroying animals and plants. But before I go on, I want to present a side note. The movies I'm talking about next happen in a different chronological order than when they come out, so bear with me on that. So we're going to take a look at the first kind of movie that plays with genetics, and that being Godzilla versus Biolantis. Basically, what happens is a bunch of scientists get together and they cross Godzilla DNA, plant DNA, and human DNA, and it becomes a giant plant monster that starts destroying Tokyo. And you can clearly parallel this with the fears of people's uncertainty when they saw nature. Yeah. So, this clearly parallels people's fear of nature and what's going to happen to it again. So it plays into that return to form. What's going to happen to nature? What's the deeper thing that's going to happen here? If we keep playing God, eventually something's going to happen. And it's most likely going to be bad. In an essay written by Bond Benton and Tracy Mariofiore, again, I'm probably mispronouncing it, examining the larger implications of the film Godzilla vs. Biollante, said this about what each creature truly represents and the repercussion of them. This feminized perversion of nature calls to Godzilla, the ultimate Japanese symbol of a masculine perverted nature, in a twisted representation of yin and yang, like harmony and balance. Godzilla and Biollante symbolize the masculine and feminine animal and plant, sea and land, both formed as a result of human interference with nature, like a previous In an essay written by Bond Benton and Tracy Mariofiore, examining the larger implications of Godzilla vs. Biollante, said this about what each creature represents and the repercussion of them. Again, I will link this in the description. The feminized perversion of nature calls to Godzilla the ultimate Japanese symbol of a masculine perverted nature, in a twisted representation of yin and yang, like harmony and balance. Godzilla and Biollante symbolize the masculine and the feminine, animal and plant, sea and land, both formed as a result of human interference with nature. Like previous entries in the film series, human arrogance demands punishment for the natural world. The rise of a reborn Godzilla creature to battle Biollante and become, in the words of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the destroyer of worlds. J. Robert Oppenheimer, a famous physicist who worked on the nuclear bomb, was assured by Dr. Shiragami's violation of natural order, the combination of human, plant, and beast. Dr. Shiragami being the person who creates Biollante in the first place. So this quote really breaks it down. It brings in gender roles, which you can really see, since Biollante is basically a rose, and a rose is a symbol of femininity, and Godzilla being, just a hulking beast. The perfect symbol of masculinity. But it plays back to that return to form. It talks about how there's a price to be paid when you play with nature. When you play God, you gotta give something back. And this plays into that. So, let's talk about mankind and nature. Like I said before, this was a new time for genetic engineering. We just started to take off. And Biollante can be that symbolization of arrogance, like it talked about in the quote. Biollante, as a symbol of arrogance, it plays into that fear of genetics, like I talked about earlier. Like how, people were uncertain about what was going to happen. Genetics was this new crazy thing that not many people knew about, or could learn about, or understood about. But people knew that, genetics, you play God, there's an arrogance to that. And seeing Biollante, this creature birthed from arrogance, on the screen, really played into that fear. So, where do we go from here? We're going to move to a different movie. One of my favorites, including one of my favorite villains, is Godzilla vs. Hedorah, or sometimes referred to as Godzilla vs. Smog Monster. So, the plot of this film is pretty straightforward. The deeper meaning is right there in the plot. It's a bunch of waste that becomes irradiated and becomes a giant monster that can transform between a monster and a flying spaceship looking thing that can emit a deadly smog that basically smothers people. So that's it. That's the deeper meaning to this. There's a theme song in it. So this film includes a song called Save the Earth by Adrian Russ. A lyric from the song is about how there's too much mercury in the water and too much pollution in the air. This is, like I said, one of the more in-your-face kind of approaches rather than the subtlety of the originals. However, it fits the motif of fear of nature. In an article written about the movie, the author, Brian Long, says pollution is humanity's monster and it will destroy us all. Which is true. Nature didn't create pollution, people do. People create their own monsters. I'd like to call back to Jurassic World. There's a point in that movie where a geneticist named Dr. Henry Wu talks about how being a monster is a completely relevant thing. To a canary, the cat is the monster. People are just used to being the cat. But in the context of Jurassic World, he creates a new cat, and the humans become the canary. And it's the same thing here. Humans polluted and created their own cat, their own monster to make them feel like the canary. And Hedorah not only kind of plays with that idea of man-made monsters, just like Godzilla did in the 50s, but it also kind of references a lot of rhetoric that we see today. There's a point in the movie where a cop responds to a call about Hedorah attacking a factory, and the cop responds by saying, "Hedorah is not real, and you know it." Which really reflects a lot of sentiment today. It really kind of shows the ignorance, right? There's people who deny climate change, there's people who deny what's happening during the pandemic, and it all played into the fact that, it just made Hedorah stronger. Kind of like the people who deny all this stuff kind of make pollution stronger, make the pandemic longer. It really plays against what the intention is. When people fail to realize that they're no longer the cat, then people are never going to know when they're the canary. So, moving on, this marks, the end of Godzilla and the hidden meaning behind it, at least until it became rebooted in the 2010s. So, let's go on to the Millennium Period. And during the Millennium Period, Godzilla became exactly what you'd expect of a monster of fiction. So, the movies were pretty much for commercial gain. He fought a monster of the week, and that was it. So, we need to look at these movies in a broader aspect. And, why it became commercialism that drove Godzilla. Well, it's because they wanted to introduce into new markets. This is during this Millennium Period is when the 1999 Godzilla movie came out in the United States, featuring Matthew Broderick. Yes, it mirrors the original Godzilla from the 50s, where a nuclear test goes wrong and an iguana becomes Godzilla. But it doesn't have the same impact. It doesn't have the same impact that the original Godzilla does. It doesn't really have a deeper meaning to it. It's more like a return to form if the form was just to focus on the destruction and mayhem. So, moving on from this, Godzilla became a product rather than an allegory. After the film, there was a spin-off TV animated series that, was mildly popular. But still, the TV series was again a monster of the week. Japan, seeing the disaster that was the US Godzilla movie, parodied the monster created by Roland Emmerich. And in one of the Godzilla sequels during this time, Godzilla just straight up kills the US Godzilla. Like, there's not even a big fight leading up to it. He just laser blasts the Godzilla and poof, it's done. It's gone from the memory of everyone who ever saw the movie. And it's just like a boxing match. Like I said, it's a Monster of the Week kind of deal. So it's basically, you get a marquee ahead of the time. Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla versus Space Godzilla. And you buy your tickets, and then you go to the theater and you watch the boxing match, but you always know Godzilla's going to win. So it just kind of lost all that deeper stuff. So where does that leave us today? So, Godzilla from... Well, I'd like to make a correction from before. I did do some research about Godzilla. Shin Godzilla, to be more specific. Shin Godzilla is a direct parallel to the tsunamis and the Fukushima nuclear reactor disaster. And this Godzilla goes back to the original in a couple of ways. Again, it's a personification of fear. The people see it as a manifestation of the disasters and impose their fear onto it. They project that fear to it. And the film ends when people freeze it. Before it really has a chance to destroy Japan. They freeze it in its tracks. So it kind of plays into this nationalism almost. That, they survive this disaster, they'll survive the next. The Japanese people overcame the adversity thrust upon them, and imbued them with a sense of nationalism. And the final movie we're going to examine is Godzilla. Godzilla was released in 2014. It's the Legendary Pictures version. Now, this one shifts again. It takes away Godzilla, the protector of Tokyo, Godzilla, the personification of nuclear testing, the personification of events in the nation. And what it does is make Godzilla the protector of nature. Godzilla comes to balance nature in this movie. So a bunch of giant mutated monsters begin attacking a city. And you know who comes to the rescue? Godzilla. Godzilla comes to maintain the balance. Those monsters aren't supposed to be there. So, in the same article by Brian Long, he quotes Dr. Shirazawa from the film. He says, "The arrogance of man is thinking nature is in our control and not the other way around." Godzilla's nature. He's nature personified as its protector. Man doesn't control nature. Man can only witness nature. So, Godzilla is nature, but it provides the balance of nature. And by providing this balance, it kind of puts that perspective on the people that, what's happening isn't in our control. It's outside of it, completely outside of our control. And, that's the end of the Godzilla franchise now. And like I said, I'm not going to cover Godzilla King of the Monsters. I might, check it out some other time. But Godzilla is a name that struck fear in the hearts of Japanese citizens as it evolved into a symbol of balance between mankind and nature. However, the name Godzilla has been tarnished in the pop culture spotlight because of movies that make fun of itself, but the spirit of Godzilla from the 50s had a power behind him. And that power was enough to carry the meaning through mostly every period of Godzilla's long history. So, to conclude this video, I'd like to say that despite the backlash and the lack of proper analysis of Godzilla, the deep meaning of the character still exists today. Yeah, the meaning has shifted and evolved and changed, but it's a franchise that still has that. And not many franchises can say that they still have that meaning they had when they started. And yeah, it lost its meaning somewhere along the way, but who hasn't? But it came back with an even better meaning, one that can echo a little bit louder today. And with that, I'll leave you with the quote, "Life finds a way." I hope you all had a pleasant experience. I'd like to start a discussion in the comments, see what you guys think about this. And I wish you all a good day.